Well, when we, I think, talk about nothingness, it has its opposite with a being that first there is something, then there is nothing. And so there are different versions of something, and as they fall, they enter into nothing. So if it's a little, sorry, confusing, so let me just make it a bit more clear if I can. If you make yourself put yourself in 5 different boxes. So the first box is your physical body. And so you experience a self through the physical body, you know. In other words, let's say you go out with someone, they're really, really good looking, and it inspires attraction, okay? And then you gravitate towards this person. And if someone asks you, for example, why are you with this person, you say, well, he's really good looking, for example. So there's a stage where you and I kind of have a self, but that self is purely physical. Okay. Then there comes a point where, because of your physical self is involved in, just society, day-to-day stuff of life, you have no choice but to have some emotions be created inside you. Okay, so when your boyfriend, for example, comes home, he may be very good looking. The problem is because of the, say, argument you had the night before, and that argument created a good amount of negative emotions. You no longer relate to the relationship as something physical, but now something emotional. Now the two of you sit and talk about the things you talked about and how it made each of you feel. So when you pass the physical self, then you get into the emotional self, that you talk about various events that has taken place in your life and the emotions they have created for you, and then you're trying to kind of figure out the emotions, trying to figure out what to do with them, why they're there, if there is a way to get rid of them, and depending on the degrees of intensity in these emotions. Some are very, very mild, so there is no reason really to think about them or wrestle with them. Some happen to be somewhat intense. And the more potent or the more intense they are, what happens is it's going to take you a longer time to figure them out. So when you move from physical to emotional, there is going to be this desert period where you want to go back and experience yourself through the physical. But it's as if whatever you touch in the physical realm, it just doesn't nourish you in any sort of way. So you enter into this nothingness, but I don't think there is anything spiritual in it. I just think that it's just the way human beings function, that you want holding hands with your boyfriend to still mean what it did some weeks or months ago. It just doesn't. There is a void that has entered. You're looking for something else. You may or you may not know what it is that you're looking for, but what you do know is that the physical part is no longer as exciting. It's needed, it's just not as exciting, until it just completely falls apart because he just doesn't have the capacity to have meaningful conversation or have a meaningful presence. And so you enter this emotional stuff, and depending on, again, how intense, how potent, how layered those emotions are, you're going to stay in that world for a long, long time just to figure things out. Now, sometimes what happens, the emotions, because they're complicated, because they're historical, it's really difficult to kind of go back in time and figure out their genesis, how they slowly evolved and why they are the way they are at the present, for example. So they'll keep you entertained for a long, long time. And most often when you say there is nothing, for example, I've entered this space of nothingness, you go back to the physical, there is nothing. You're trying to figure out why these emotions are the way they are, and you just get frustrated and you just throw your hands up and you say, no, I just think I'm done with this stuff. And then you have no place to go forward and no place to go backwards, so you just sit there and it is nothing. But it's not, see, when you got over the physical, you tried going back, but there was nothing meaningful in it. And you had to wait for a while until the emotions come about so that you can feel relatively nourished with the emotions. And now you enter this thing called emotional self. Now, if, for example, you have some serious stuff going on, that all of a sudden slowly they have come up for you. And for me, I call it psychological, for example. It could be negative, it could be positive. You have a psychological self, which is a space that's filled with, trauma, but it has also impacted your physical body, it has also impacted your emotional body. So now you have 3 areas that give you a good amount of identity. Your physical body aches, you don't know how to move it, for example, you don't want to exercise, you don't want to do anything. And that's what trauma does. It kind of gets you sad and depressed, and you're paralyzed in certain ways. And out of the psychology, you have certain very, very intense emotions that are caused by the trauma inside. And if the physical was only physical, if the emotional was only emotional, and had some physical, consequences, the psychological is very, very, very complex, because not only does it create emotions you don't really want to have. You wake up angry and you're always moody, and you have lost your ability to trust and to have faith, and to some extent, you also predict and you have good access to know how your future is going to unfold, because and this is like a different stage in life where you have tried and relatively successfully to run away from the psychological stuff, a past that has kind of bled into all these different areas of life. You didn't know, you weren't aware. But as you age, as the physical self kind of fades, as the emotional self fades, all of a sudden you say, well, I have this stuff and it's been around for a long, long time. And so there is a self that is psychological. And then you have to juggle, because the juggling means there are days that your physical body aches, so you become the physical self. There are days where you just have these emotions where nobody really wants to be around you. That's the emotional self, where you say, I need to be a bit more sociable. I need to laugh more, smile more, be friendly with people. And there are days where you're just a psychological self, which is you have access to this past of yours, and you know how haunting it is, you know how intense and potent and negative it is, and there isn't much you can do. And then it creates a good amount of paralysis, it creates a good amount of depression, it creates a good amount of loneliness. I mean, that's what pain generally does. It does create a good amount of loneliness. And you try to share your loneliness with another, but this is an emotional body that no one can reach. There is no one to lay with, unlike the physical. And even as you're trying to distract yourself, let's just say, by being with someone, you know full well why you're being with this person. It's not because you like him or you love him or you enjoy their company, but it's a way out of being too aware of the psychological self that's just ever present wherever you go. Now, for some people who don't really have that particular past, the traumatic past, the psychological self doesn't exist. And you could replace it by, say, a set of belief systems. You've read a lot of books and you have a certain position about certain branches of life. And so that is what you identify with. Then there is this thing called the intellectual self. And remember, as you transition from one self to another, you go into these desert areas where there is nothing, and it's it's you try to dip back into the old self to find meaning, purpose, identity, but they're just not working. And so there's a period of nothingness. There is no future because you have no access to it. You don't have experience with it. You don't know. You don't have any maps, no GPS. So you go to the, what you're familiar with, but it no longer works. That not working, you enter sadness and depression and loneliness. Okay, but again, it's not because you're questing for this grand understanding of what does it mean to be me, what does it mean to be alive, is there a God, is there a truth, is there like a self of sorts. There is nothing spiritual about it. It's just, I think, part of our growing periods. We go from this stage to that stage. Then there is the intellectual stage where you identify with the things you believe in, the books you've read, the ideas you've had. If I, for example, was to say, Middle East is the way it is because of, say, America, and America is the way it is because of Caucasians, for example. And because you've read a few things, now you raise your hand or you say, I don't think that's true because of A, B, C, D. And you and I will go back and forth with this particular issue for like the next 5-6 hours. We shout, we scream, we laugh. We try to be sarcastic, not to destroy our friendship completely. And that becomes the intellectual self. Then there comes a point, and it's important to recognize all of this because sometimes when you get into depression, but you've had, or sadness, or you begin to ask questions, because you and I have read books, because we've, to some extent, have read the Bible, for example, we know a thing or two about the spiritual world, or spiritual ideas, or theology, or so on and so forth. The assumption is that every nothingness has a spiritual quality to it. It could have, but I think for the most part, it's really devoid of that. It's just, you're going through things that everybody goes through. You go back into a world that can no longer really nourish you. You try it because you don't know what else to do, but it fails to nourish you. And so you enter this desert life, and you're just waiting for someone to come into your life and inspire you emotionally, so you can have the physical as well as the emotional. Or you can have the physical, the emotional, as well as the intellectual. That, kind of like someone who knows a thing or two about Gurdjieff. So intellectually, they're really versed about the fourth way school. They're also quite attractive. So physically, they can nourish you as well. And emotionally, they're also available. They say, okay, you made me upset, but I'm not going to consider that. I'm not going to be attached to how you made me feel. I'm going to let the feelings go. So they can kind of create all these kind of mature perspectives about themselves, and you become attracted to it. There comes a period where you have been through the physical, and you have been through the emotional, and you have been through the intellectual. If there are psychological issues, I think you can quest the spiritual as a coping mechanism, as something, it's in Iran a couple of days ago, a father had lost his son in the riot. And the son was like 25, 26. And the father says, well, I'm very proud of my son having died in the battlefield for justice and truth. Well, there is really nothing spiritual about that, except that when you move into an uprising, a mass movement, you're connected to an idea that's really bigger than life, bigger than tables and chairs. It's one of those moments of transcendence that you're connected to something really quite sacred, the idea of justice, and equality and fairness, and women, have a say, they have a voice, they are human beings, they have rights. And so in some sense, it is a much better death than living to be 90, having a relatively waste of a life, though you've done a lot of things, and then you just die in bed either sick or just in your sleep. So you can, as all of us do, and there is nothing wrong with it. Life is difficult, it's complicated, it's traumatic, and there is nothing wrong with having a toolbox where one of the tools in the toolbox happens to be religion or spirituality, where every time something about you breaks, you read the Bible. Every time something about you breaks, you gather and have a conversation with people that you call like-minded. Nothing wrong with any of that. I think as long as you have tools and those tools help you be relatively healthy, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and they help you not go completely crazy or nuts, I think it's really, really good. The father could have gone completely crazy. It's a son, mothers wail and fathers say, well, it's God's will, There comes a point where you have been in all these worlds, not the psychological part, but you have been to the physical, you have been to the emotional and the intellectual. And there is no longer anything to fight for. You don't find any value in the physical. You don't find anything value in the emotional. And you don't find anything valuable in having conversations, because deep down you're connected to a certain set of questions that the mind can't reach. Other people don't really understand what it is that you're going through. So here you are with a body, and everybody assumes that just because you're walking you have a purpose, and just because you're talking about something you're passionate and you find it valuable and meaningful, that's what you're talking about. Underneath of those things, what they don't see, and perhaps what you yourself don't see, is as I'm walking and as I'm talking, as I'm feeling about Plato or Socrates or Jesus Christ, I really don't care about any of this stuff. You do it because it's a job, you do it because 40 students are sitting looking at you, trying to anticipate what's going to come out of your mouth, the next moment. And then you go and you sit in the office and you say, what the hell am I doing here? What am I doing? And you begin to ask questions and you begin to read books. By this time, if anybody is able, and this is just my own position, and I may be wrong, and other people may respond to your question in a much better and mature and healthier way, but I think that by the time you get this nothingness, where the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual are basically sidelined, you have been in those worlds and they've proven themselves to be insufficient. Very much like Job, you say, why doesn't the earth open up and swallow me? It's a very, very strange place to be, I think, for anyone who has kind of transcended those three stages of identity ourselves, because you sit on the top and you look at your body. It's healthy. It doesn't create pain, which means that you don't get pulled back into your physical body. So your body can't really give you identity. Your emotions, you kind of approach life events and the sort of emotions they create inside you in a very, very mature way. You don't get attached to any of them. There is nothing to be attached to. Things come, things go. You kind of look at yourself as the screen of a movie theater, the TV screen. You watch everything come and go. And then, someone asks you, what book have you read? And you say, what is there to read, really? I think I've shared this with you. I remember walking with Krishnamurti one day, and it's quite lush, and he sits, he's tired, he's old, He says, so do you have any questions? And I put my head on his lap and I say, no. I mean, I do, but you can't answer my question. And he simply says, I understand. I understand. Now, what happens when you get to this stage, in every stage of nothingness, you're going to be a wanderer. You know, you have no home, you have no place to go, you have no friends. But the life of when you pass the physical stage and you enter the desert life, you're going to stay in this desert for maybe a month. That's really way too long. It never takes that long. You'll probably be there for a few days before something emotional happens to you and you just begin to play with the emotions. And then your body will help you, you know, with those emotions. It'll carry you here and there, give you purpose and meaning. So there is engagement and activity and, you know, inspiration, motivation. So when you're done just being pushed around by your emotions, and then you say, I really want to kind of understand, you know, I want to reflect about how these emotions come about and how these emotions impact my body. That's another kind of emptiness of desert life you're in, because you've never been in the world of the intellect. And I don't mean intellect in the academic or, you know, contemporary sense. I mean the ability to simply sit and really reflect about the emotions, their history, why they're caused, how they are caused, the sort of physical environment you occupy that causes those emotions, how those emotions impact your physical body. And then because you and I are social, how the play of emotions impact our ways in the classroom, or our conversations with our parents or with our friends. Are you mean-spirited? Are you passive? Are you aggressive? And so because you haven't had experience with that world, you kind of go into this desert. You want to, again, be pushed around by your emotions, but you have a good sense about you. And it says, no, I've been here, I've done that, I don't want to do this anymore, but I don't really know how exactly to control all of the stuff down here. So the emotion of anger no longer makes you feel powerful, you just feel pathetic. You feel bad about being possessed by such cheap winds blowing you here and there. And if anger used to be a motivating force for you to say, yes, I'm strong, I'm powerful, I'm this, it no longer does that for you. So you just sit in a very vacant environment. And if in the physical, you know, the desert was about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and from emotional to intellectual, it's going to be a bit longer. Because as you move up, things become more and more complicated, you know. It's not difficult to feel, but it's very difficult to think, you know. And the nice thing about the world of reflection being complicated is because it can actually entertain you for a long time. You can sit and read books for the rest of your life. You know, even someone like Houston Smith, he was 90 and he said, I think I have another book left in me. You know, I mean, from one perspective you can say, yes, he's old. And it's great that he has such a sharp mind, because there are a lot of, you know, 60, 70-year-olds who are just kind of vegging out. There's a 90-year-old man whose mind is sharp. He finds himself on his mind active enough, worthy enough to sit and think some more thoughts. So there are lots of people who kind of just stay in this world of reflection and they just go on. And there is also another aspect to this thing called reflection, which is you can sit down and unpack Chaucer, You can sit down and unpack, I don't know, Plato, and you're trying to understand yourself through another. And there is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong in understanding Chaucer because you have found some passages to inspire you. So you read Beethoven, you read Chaucer, you read Shakespeare too, so that you can gain a better understanding of who and what you are. Not so much as a physical body, and not certainly so much as an emotional body, as just what it means to be a reflective human being. And maybe Shakespeare will give you access to all three parts, the physical, emotional, and the intellectual. Then there comes a point and remember, all of us from time to time experience the meaninglessness of everything that we have done. But luckily, they don't really stay with us for too long, and we find our way back to meaning and purpose and identity. There comes a point where you just don't care about ideas anymore, and your reflection is not so much outward, your reflection is inward. As in, you're not trying to unpack someone like Shakespeare, you're not trying to unpack what Rumi is saying in this passage or that passage. You kind of try to go within and reflect on things that inspire you. And I don't really know how that works. How, as you're like sitting and all of a sudden you say, let me grab a pen and a notepad and just begin to write. And you write some very, very inspiring and beautiful, prose and poetry. There comes a point where you've just given up on reflection. It just doesn't do anything for you. You kind of find all of these tools as a form of entertainment. Now you begin to seek something. And I'm not quite sure what it is that we seek, but you say, and this is where I think true meditation comes about. You have moved your physical self here and there for the past 20 years, and you've grown tired. You've moved your emotional self here and there to this party, to that party, to this friend, to that friend, and you've outgrown that. You've engaged in a good amount of meaningful conversations about various things in life, whether it's social justice or philosophical ideas, the ones that come out of Plato and Socrates, or the religious ideas that come out of Jesus. And you say, no, I don't really want any of that. It doesn't do anything for me. Now, you have to understand, when you talk about nothingness, Alison, in nothingness there is nothing to grab. There is nowhere to go. There is nothing to see. There are no impressions to be had. So in every nothingness there is sadness, there is depression, there is loneliness, there is alienation, there is a good amount of anger, and there isn't much you can do. Okay? And you're able to kind of get yourself on top of this water if only there is something for you to hang on and pull yourself up and out. If you're sad and depressed and you're simply going through the TV channels, all of a sudden you stop at The Sopranos and say, yes, I want to watch this show. And that's the rope that will help you come out and at least be, to some extent, active, entertained, alive, excited for maybe an hour and a half before your eyes and your body just gives. So I'm just far too exhausted. When you simply sit, or you walk around like a zombie, you're completely aimless. It's what Krishnamurti would probably call a pathless path, that you don't really know where you're going, you don't know what you're doing. You have no use for your body, you have no use for your emotions, you have no use for your intellect. You kind of sit in the middle of nowhere. And for the most part, you don't look at anyone, you don't look at anything. Because what happens when you look at something, it's as if, you sit in this room, you close your eyes because you know that there is this nothingness and there is no escape from it. The moment you open your eye and you look at that picture on the wall, that very look it robs you of the nothingness you lived in. It creates a self. However intense, however pathetic that self may be, a self is created. That painting, on the wall robs you of your realization that there is nothing in you worth doing anything. You don't need to walk. You don't need to think. You don't need to feel. You just sit. And the problem with this nothingness, it's not going to be just 2 weeks, and it's not going to be just 2 months. It's going to be and the saying that it's not in your time that you will understand, but in God's time. Something like that, I think. Where this particular nothingness, you just have to sit, and you just sit, and you just sit. And, your existence is quite pathetic. There is nothing about you that means anything. You have no use for your body. Your emotions mean nothing. Your intellect means nothing. You don't engage in any conversation. And and because you've been there, you've done that, you don't allow any... it's not that you don't allow. Nothing out there can inspire any feelings or emotions about you. And even if they do, their life is very, 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 very short. And that's where the spiritual quest begins, because the spiritual quest, it has no need for your body, it has no need for your emotions, it has no need for your psychology, and has no need for for your thinking. It has nothing to do with any of that stuff. And so, because it has nothing to do with your physical, emotional, intellectual, psychological life, that's when the spiritual quest begins. Now, the problem with this particular quest at this stage is no book can satisfy it. No place that you can go physically can satisfy it. No amount of reflection can satisfy it. And you have this strange sense of longing, but you just don't know what it is that you're longing for. It's not a longing for physical health. It's not a longing for emotional health. And I don't think it's important for people to get to this particular state of nothingness, where all of a sudden, after 5, 6, 10 years of being depressed, being lonely, being sad, having no purpose, having no meaning, all of a sudden there's a spark and they realize something, like the Buddha, like Jesus, like Muhammad, and again, depending on how intense your quest is, how intense your longing, is. See, when we talk about Muhammad, for example, Muhammad could go into the cave and feel the nothingness, but he could go back out and be a merchant, continue being a merchant. If the Urantia book is right, that Jesus went to Persia, went to India, went to Egypt, then this is a man who could not be a merchant, he can't be in the cave and sit in nothingness and then go out there and make money. That's not the way Jesus works. That was the way Muhammad would work, but not Jesus. Moses could be a shepherd at the same time be nothing. So he could occupy both worlds. But someone as intense as Jesus, the story is very, very, very different for him. The story of the Buddha is very much like the story of Jesus. They're both introverts. They both walk away from everything. And very much as Jesus occupies a desert for so many years, the Buddha does the same thing. He just sits and does nothing. I don't think people need to do that. I think the spiritual quest is really, really for people. It's kind of like, being a very elite athlete. Not everybody can be a Messi, not everybody can be a Ronaldo, not everybody can be a Bjorn Borg or a Muhammad Ali or a Roger Federer. And I think, Jesus is like the spiritual athlete. He's been number one for a long, long time, and no one comes even close. And not everyone needs to be like, in that state of nothingness. And the problem with being in that state of nothingness, Alison, which is, I think, even far more devastating, is when you have realized your spiritual self, whatever shape or form it may be or it may take, whenever someone asks you a question, that question cannot enter your physical self. That question cannot enter your emotional self or your intellectual self. It has to enter your spiritual self. Let me see if I can explain that a little bit better. See, a physical self doesn't have much of a longevity. An emotional self also doesn't have much of a longevity. It's something that eventually you could outgrow. An intellectual self, it's good. It's good for critical thinking. It's good for decision making. But someone who's beyond all those three stages of being, whenever you give them something, it goes through the spiritual filter, and they season it with whatever the spiritual self wants to season it. In other words, what they do is they don't go back to their history trying to find a box where this question can become relevant, and then pick out certain files from that box, open it and say, okay, according to the box I have just, the file I just read through, the answer to a question is A, B, C, D. It's kind of like the poem that, I think it's Abu Sa'id Abu Khair. گر بنوازی ز جان خروشان توییم ور ننوازی هم از خموشان توییم. If you enter into me, then my body will move, my emotions will move, my intellect will move. If you don't enter into me, I'll simply sit. I'll be okay with being a lifeless corpse. There's nothing wrong with that, because I don't want physical, emotional, or intellectual selves to enter into me. I just want the spiritual. And and that can take variety of different shapes and forms. I'm going to leave that because it's something I myself don't even understand quite well just yet. But I think it's okay for people to simply be occupied with a physical self. Like they're sick, for example, and they don't really know what to do with their sickness, and there is no cure for their sickness. And so once in a while they tap into the Bible, because that's the only tool they have to find any answer. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Is there emptiness in that? Absolutely. Is there nothingness in that? Definitely. Is there paralysis, sadness, sorrow, yearning, prayer? It contains all of those things. but it's rooted in physical illness. There are some people who are just sick and tired of being moody, or sick and tired of just being negative, or sick and tired of feeling anger. Or they're sick and tired of being around someone who's physically unwell, who's emotionally unwell. And so they tap into the Bible, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Because remember, you get up and you want to make yourself an omelet, you have a good day, but you have someone who's not well, whether it's physical or emotional, and your omelet goes out the window, your dreams go out the window, and you need a coping mechanism. And so, you look at your life, you have everything, but nothing means anything because you have someone who's not well in your life. And so you spend the rest of your days taking care of this person. Okay, so you go to church. Good for you. There's nothing wrong with that. And it may even be that Jesus may appear to you. I don't really know how these things work. And it may be that the experience is potent enough where you're able to season your life, your physical life, which is somewhat of a mess, or your emotional life, which is somewhat a mess. You could kind of season it with the experience or visions that you've had. Whether or not those visions or experiences are true, or whether the figment of your imagination, who cares? It doesn't really matter. They make you be a better person. They give you certain assumptions about yourself. Those assumptions kind of guide you. They're like a map to who and what you are, what you want to do, what you desire, what sort of conversations you want to have, what sort of friendships you want to have, and that's good. At least you're not like this leaf in the middle of nowhere being pushed around by the wind. And there are some people who take, refuge and comfort in, just reading books and, going to fourth way meetings and talking about this. Nothing wrong with that.